Hi everybody and welcome back to Miss Angler's biology class. I am Miss Angler and I cannot believe it is that time of year again. It is matric final exams. It is going to be your 2025 Paper 1 Life Sciences exam prediction. I'm so excited to get into things that I think are going to come up in this exam this year. And before we dive in, I don't want to forget to remind you that if you haven't got your hands on your cheat sheet yet, the Life Sciences Grade 12 one, you should totally think about getting one for this final exam. Don't forget, we also have loads of other subjects like accounting, physics, and mathematics. So keep that in mind as you prepare for your upcoming exams. Now, if you're a member, you are actually watching this video way ahead of everybody else. Don't forget that I do have a YouTube membership, everybody, where we do live lessons. You get access to my cheat sheet guide for free. And you get early access to videos like this one, the prediction video. Now, as always, I like to put a little disclaimer to this series of videos. I want you to know that I haven't seen the final paper. I know it feels like I have because year after year, I keep getting it right. And I have to credit that to a couple of different things. One, I have to credit it to the fact that I've been teaching life sciences for a really long time, over a decade. I'm a senior matric marker. I also am the head of life sciences at my school, so I feel like I've got a lot of experience. I know what examiners are looking for. I also look at trends. I look at what are the examiners trying to get out of pupils based off of the diagnostic report that they put out every year. And so I take all of these resources together and I give you essentially my educated guess. Now, I've been doing pretty well these last few years, I've been getting it pretty much right every year, but it's always really stressful for me to do these videos because I never know what's really going to be in the exam. And so the purpose of these videos is to just guide you into the correct state of mind. Make sure that you've covered everything. I might mention something that you didn't realize you needed to know, and you're going to be so glad that you watched the video because you covered it and you saw it and you knew, oh, that's something I would have never gone over. I'm also going to give you a little bit of an indication of perhaps the type of questions they're going to be asking you, as well as the examiner's vibe and energy, because examiners change year on year, and it looks like the examiners have changed once again. It looks like it is the same examiner that wrote the 2023, 2024, and now this 2025 paper. And so we tend to see a bit of a rhythm of the same kinds of questions coming from the same set of examiners. So without further ado, no more chit chat, let's get down to business. Let's go through what I think is going to be in the exam paper, starting off with multiple choice. Things first, I see a little bit more attention is going to probably be given to plant hormones or plant responses, whether that be through plants moving through tropisms, plants with their defense mechanisms, and even things like plants and their ability to use auxins for weed control. So I'm seeing a lot of energy that's going to probably happen around in those spaces of multiple choice. Also, to remind you that throughout the video, I'm also going to pop up alongside me examples of questions that I've seen in past papers. And you, of course, can pause the video at that time. You can do those questions to practice with, and I think that's a great idea. I have taken a lot of the questions from past papers, and you'll be able to see which past paper I got it from by looking at the top of the question on the page. Next thing that I think is going to be quite important in this exam is the amniotic egg. Now, I specifically want to focus on the layers and the structures inside of the egg. I want to talk about the yolk. I feel like there's a lot of energy around the size of the yolk, the importance of the yolk. And we might actually see this question pop up later in the paper as well. I've made a note of it here in my notes that it potentially could be a slightly longer question about the amniotic egg. So just make sure you're very well versed in what do all the layers do inside the amniotic egg, and what are their counterparts in the human egg structure. But I'll come back to that in a later question. Next up is going to be homeostasis. Now, homeostasis is quite a big section if you actually look at the mark allocation, because homeostasis and endocrine, for that matter, they go together. When I speak about homeostasis, I'm speaking about homeostasis and the endocrine system. They've got a lot going on. Everything from thermoregulation all the way to the testes and the ovaries producing hormones and their ability to maintain homeostasis. You've got a lot going on there. And I think there's going to be a lot of questions around hormones. It might not be in the multiple choice. It might also show itself in the terms, but I'll pick it up in the terminology section shortly. But really know all your hormone names, even the unusual ones they almost never ask. Something I noticed when I was going through all of the past papers and I look back at my old notes from last year and the year before is I keep writing the word, that's an unusual term to ask for. That's an unusual question to ask. It seems to me that this particular examiner likes to ask the unusual questions, the unusual structures, as well as the unusual hormones or the unusual layers and functions of things that we don't normally focus our studying on. Last but not least, there is a big emphasis and push for me in the multiple choice around the eye. I think it's probably going to lean more into the receptors of the eye. So think of like the rods and the cones, the retina, stuff like that. But I don't just want to limit it down to just the eye. I think it's also important to note that the examiners seem to be pushing a lot more for your knowledge around the receptor cells and the receptor bodies. For example, like the cristae and the maculae inside of the ear for balance and posture. You have to know those really well as the organ of corti for hearing. So make sure that your receptor knowledge is concrete. Now we go on to terminology. Now this section for me is really important, grade 12s, because I feel like a lot of us don't put enough time and energy into terminology, and it's often a good indication of how you're going to do well in the rest of the exam. So speaking of terminology, for some reason I'm feeling like oval window is going to make an appearance. It's going to make an appearance because we often don't study it. We don't know what the oval window does. We don't know where it is. We don't know, or should I say, we rather confuse it with the round window. And I'm going to mention oval window again when we do A, B, both, and none, because I think it might reappear there where you have to decide, is it the round window or the oval window that we use this, what do we use it for? Like, what is its structure? What is its function? Similarly, speaking about receptors, I think that they're going to ask you something about the ear bones in the terminology section. Ossicles, stirrup or stapes, the hammer, the anvil. Now, you don't need to know the Latin names of these words. You can just call them the stirrup, the hammer, the anvil. But I think a lot of us don't study those names. We just call them ossicles. But recently, I think in last year's paper, or perhaps the paper before that, you had to know the specific names of each individual bone. And a lot of people didn't know the order of the bones. They didn't know that they went from big to small. They didn't know which one was the one closest to the eardrum and which one is closest to the cochlea. So let's make sure that we're very, very clear on that. And linking to that as well, is going to be all of your neuron structures. Now, last year we saw a lot of myelin sheath, okay? 2 separate questions just on myelin. I don't think that that's going to reappear this year. What I've actually made a note of is more of your bigger structures in your nervous system. So I'm thinking things like your ventricle in your brain, your corpus callosum in your brain, its function. Know those things, please. I also think that they might ask you something about the axon or the dendrite when it comes to the neurons. Now, earlier on, I spoke about the homeostatic and endocrine system, and I said that we need to know our unusual hormones, right? What quantifies or what qualifies as a unusual hormone? That's probably what you're asking yourself. Well, I'm thinking that they're going to be looking for things like prolactin, adrenaline, or growth hormone, GH, which is growth hormone. I think that we need to know these ones because I do think they're going to get their time to shine. They're all pituitary gland hormones, and the pituitary gland is going to get a bit of a moment in this exam coming up. Likewise, and finally, linked in terminology is going to be the exo and endocrine meaning. I think that, again, a lot of matrics don't know the difference between an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. And this also has the possibility of coming up in the A, B, both, or none section. Because remember, those 2 words are often confused with each other, so they lend themselves to being a perfect A, B, both, or none question. Which of course then leads me into, just as I mentioned now, the A, B, both, or none questions. So remember what the examiner is trying to do. They are trying to confuse you here. They often use two similar terms to see if you can tell the difference. And so if you are studying for paper 1, you've got to think about all the words that are similar to one another that you often confuse with each other, either because they sound the same or because they have a similar function. For example, what is the difference between a cranial nerve and a spinal nerve? Another one, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. As I just mentioned to you now, the endocrine glands and the exocrine gland. I think that you can often just predict yourself what are the possible questions that they can ask you, because there's very few words that are similar to one another that we get confused. The other thing is that if they don't sound similar, but their functions are close, like FSH and LH, a lot of matrics confuse them together and they don't know what does what. I think that that is what lends itself to being a good A, B, both or none question. Now that we get to the end of question 1, you will start to see that the questions get a little bit longer, 1.4, 1.5, even 1.6. These questions will be heavily based off diagrams, okay? And the first diagram that I think is going to come up is a nervous system diagram. I think it's going to be a brain of some kind. You're going to identify the medulla oblongata, the spinal cord, the cerebrum, the cerebellum, stuff like that. So in this instance, we need to be good at labeling the brain, but we also need to know the brain's regions, functions, so that if they're broken, we know what's not going to work. Linked to that might also be a small, short question about the central nervous system versus the peripheral nervous system. You might even have to tabulate a difference. And that reminds me, you have to draw a table, a graph, or a diagram in almost every exam. Next thing that I see popping up in question 1.4 or 1.5 is going to be a basic female reproductive question. You're going to have a female reproductive structure, and you're going to have some basic questions, right? I don't think it's going to be too difficult yet. I do think some of the harder questions will come later, and I will get into that shortly. But I think it's going to be like maybe a fallopian tube with an egg and then some sperm swimming to it, and there might even be some questions about implantation. Now we're going to get into the much more complicated and difficult section of question 2 and question 3. Now, I'm just going to list these questions in no particular order. I don't actually know what physical order they will appear in, but what I can say for certain is that question 2 is often reproduction, reproductive strategies, and the nervous system, whereas question 3 is more about homeostasis, the endocrine and plant hormones. And often question 3 has an investigation question in it, you know, one where you have to give the aim, the variables, maybe you have to draw a graph. I will talk about that a little bit later because I have made some notes about what I think might be the investigative question later on in question 3. Starting off with the first question, I think that might appear in question 2 or 3 is going to be the eye, and specifically the eye will be in relation to the following things. The question will maybe ask you to, label a couple of things inside the eye, but I think it's going to speak more about accommodation and binocular vision. Okay, they haven't asked accommodation in a couple of exam cycles, and they've asked pupillary mechanism quite a few times, but I think accommodation is going to make an appearance. And I think maybe a little 2 or 3 mark question about what is binocular vision and, what is so good about binocular vision. There may even be a small question around rods and cones, meaning the receptors in the eye and the ability to see color as well as to see in low light levels, which is the difference between the two. Cones are for color, rods are for like black, white, darker, low light environment. For some reason, I also get this feeling like there's going to be an astigmatism question. Astigmatism, if you don't know and you've forgotten, is when you have 2 focal points in the back of your eye and your vision is blurry. Please know you have to be able to correct that. You need to know what kind of lens you need to place inside of the eye or in front of the eye to correct astigmatism. The next question that I think is going to pop up is spematogenesis. Now, they might not necessarily have the male reproductive organs. They might, but it might also be like a case study question, where they give you like a scientific investigation about what they've done with men and they've done a research paper. And we're looking into the rate at which sperm are made, what makes a healthy sperm, maybe men's diet and how it influences their sperm production. I think there's going to be a question around spermatogenesis. And remember, to answer this correctly, you should be using your exam guidelines. Now, the big one, the one that I know that you're most dreading, the female hormone question. And potentially this could be two separate questions, because they are allowed to ask you a question in the reproduction section on females, and they are allowed to ask it again in a different way under the endocrine system, because remember, the ovaries fall under the endocrine system, so they can ask you another question. Now the big one, the one that I know that you are dreading the most, which is the female reproductive system and the hormones linked to that. Now, this could be split into two questions, but it could be like one big, like 14-mark question as well. Just depends, I guess, on what the examiner is trying to achieve. But let's start off with saying that the female reproductive system gets a lot of mark allocation because it can be asked both in the reproductive section and it can also be asked in the endocrine section as well. And that's why there's often a split. So the first question is often about the structures of the female system and their role in maybe the ovarian cycle. And then the second question is often leaning more heavily into the hormones. So let me break down what I think is probably going to happen. I think that we are going to start off with a case study or some kind of like research into the fallopian tubes of women. And I think it's going to be something along the lines of the fallopian tube being blocked. Maybe it's blocked with endometrium, like the endometrium has grown too high up, and that's obviously also known as endometriosis as well. And so there's like some kind of issue in the fallopian tube and it's blocked by something, or maybe there's like some other phenomenon where women's fallopian tubes are kind of bendy and they're not straight. Is the hormone of the moment, which would be FSH. So FSH is probably going to get its time to shine. It hasn't had a time to shine in a hot minute. There's been a lot of like progesterone emphasis and LH. There was a couple of questions last year on FSH, but I think FSH is going to get its time to shine when you have to describe the ovarian cycle, which remember is the entire cycle where we go from a follicle to a Graafian follicle to ovulation and then a corpus callosum. A corpus luteum. You see, even I make a mistake, okay? Even they get so close together, the corpus callosum and the corpus luteum. You must understand the negative feedback that FSH has on the other two hormones, which would be estrogen and progesterone. The next big question is probably going to be the homeostasis question. And there's so many different homeostatic controls. And so I look at a previous set of papers and I see, we haven't asked carbon dioxide in a long time, specifically carbon dioxide and how it plays a role in maintaining your body's pH. Now, this is also where the investigation question might come in. So again, this might be more of a question 3 than a question. I also think that they can marry the carbon dioxide question with a ADH or a thermoregulation question, and this is how they would do it. If they gave you the example of someone exercising, then they can ask you, how does the body maintain the carbon dioxide levels? Now you'll have to explain that. How does the body maintain the body temperature? Now you're going to have to explain vasodilation and sweating. And if you sweat, what are you doing? You're losing water. And so again, they can ask you a question about ADH, and it's expected of you in your exam guideline, an overlap between the nervous system and the endocrine system. They like to put the two together. Next up is going to be plant hormones. Now they kind of zigzag back and forth between the different tropisms. So I expect two things coming out of plants this year. One, I think it's going to be a geotropism question. It might be the classic where they have the seeds on a clinostat or a petri dish that's on its side and it's rotating. That's a classic one that they do, and they can do variations of that as well. We can also ask geotropism in the context of shoots or stems growing away from gravity. More so probably a graph question on the other hormones. I think we forget that there are other hormones. We put so much time and effort into auxins. I think this year it's going to be gibberellians, and gibberellians are a forgotten hormone. The fact that gibberellians add lateral branches, and in doing so you can also add thorns, which is a physical defense. So there's a nice like marriage of question that can go there. And okay, now the question that I think a lot of you understudy and you're not prepared for, especially whatever scenario they give you, but that's going to be the reproductive strategies, right? So that's like, is the organism oviparous, viviparous, that kind of thing. I think this year it's probably going to be a fish or a reptile. I think it's going to be a fish or a reptile. I think the main difference though is that fish are many eggs externally, whereas reptiles are many eggs internally. Now, next up, I did actually mention this earlier, but the amniotic egg, I want to come back to it quickly because I feel like there's an opportunity for the examiner to make you draw something this year. And I don't think they're going to make you draw the amniotic egg. Let's hope that they don't, because there's a lot of layers going on there. But I think they might ask you to maybe draw the human ovum, and then they might even ask you to draw a table of differences between an amniotic egg and an ovum. Speaking of amnions, I can't forget that we still have a lot of marks that we can still allocate to reproduction. And so another question, and the final question that I think will come up in reproduction, may have something to do with the amnion. And they're going to talk about things like a disease or a scenario where there isn't enough amniotic fluid, and like maybe pregnant women who don't make enough amniotic fluid. What do they do? What are the consequences of that? And you now have to know, what does amniotic fluid do, so that you also know what happens if there's not enough of it. So are allowed to ask you obviously about the structures that form, right? Which would be the chorion, the placenta, the amnion, and the amniotic fluid. Now, last but not least, I am going to wrap this up by looking at the two final questions, which would be nervous system based questions. The first one is probably going to be the ear. I think that we're going to ask ear questions, and quite in depth this year. I think they're going to ask you something about posture. And so like maintaining an upright posture. We've done a lot of movement. I think we've done a lot of movement through space. Make sure that you go over what the Eustachian tube is, or the Eustachian tube, however your teacher pronounces it. And remember, that is the tube that is regulating and equalizing the pressure in the ear. And last but not least, this is the last thing that I think may come up in this exam, is going to be the reflex arc. The reflex arc hasn't been asked in a hot minute, but I do think they're going to do something interesting with it. I think they might ask you a basic reflex. They might say like, label this, tell us what's that. But then I think they're going to integrate a disease, and they might end up integrating Alzheimer's into the disease with the reflex arc. And so they might ask you something about Alzheimer's, like what causes Alzheimer's, and you're going to speak about the plaque buildup and a degenerative disease, and the fact that it can affect your reflexes. And then last but not least about the reflex arc is, please know what a reflex action is. These two things are often confused with each other, reflex arc and reflex action. And that is it for today's video, everybody. If you like this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and comment down below what you think is going to be the hardest question in this upcoming exam. And of course, you can always ask me questions in the comment section. I love answering you as much as I can. If you're going to look out for paper 2 video, don't worry, it is going to be up soon. You'll be able to watch it very, very soon so that you can prepare for your exams. Let me know how it all goes, everybody, and good luck, and I will see you all again soon. Bye.